my pleasure to introduce Marco Paes today. And he's joining us here from SCI, and he'll be talking about trustworthy surveillance, kind of in the context of managing kind of the privacy considerations related to employees and managing the insider threats. So I'll hand it off.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So you guys have pretzels. They're properly salted. As well as my girlfriend argue whether it should be salted or not. But my name is Marco, and today I'm going to be having a little bit of a discussion about surveillance within enterprise environments. I'm going to be connecting some of the research I do both at CERT and as part of my dissertation that's kind of looking at this intersection of essentially monitoring employees and enterprise environments while also navigating some of the trust and privacy concerns that come with that. So a little bit about myself. I attended Virginia Tech for my bachelor's and master's, and I'm finishing up a PhD over at Purdue. Before this, I was over at MITRE, where I worked on some emerging technologies on security and privacy threat modeling. One of the teams I was on was the team that created the panoptic framework. If you guys have ever dabbled in that in some of your coursework, I know most of you guys are in a privacy engineering program. And currently, I am a member of the technical staff over at the CERT division of the Software Engineering Institute within CMU. I'm actually located down in Virginia, so I had a fun drive up this morning, but always love to be in Pittsburgh. My research is essentially focused, again, around enterprise threats and some of the more human-centric issues. A lot of what my team does is maintain guidance and data sets, as well as teach courses related to enterprise security. Along with that, we do research and advisory with government and industry. So a really cool part of our job is being able to actually go and do vulnerability assessments or program evaluations for kind of enterprise security and cyber risk over at government agencies or sometimes like financial institutions. Just a little bit going into this presentation. So you'll see that the focus of my research is pretty interdisciplinary. I touch on things like government and risk management, but also get a little bit more technical with some machine learning and decision science kind of work. But getting into that, let's talk about the kind of meat and potatoes of today's presentation. Let's get to understand what insider threats are. So insider threats essentially refer to the potential for an individual who's had or had access to an organization's critical assets to use that access, whether it's maliciously or unintentionally, to act in a way that can negatively affect the organization. Essentially, this is the security concept of a threat being connected to an actor within an organization who has the ability, whether it's on purpose or not on purpose, to cause some kind of harm because of that access. We see this abstract concept then of an insider. Generally speaking, we can connect this to the most common use case being an employee of an organization. But again, this could also refer to other parties. So other types of insiders that exist could be contractors, vendors, trusted business partners. In your case, students could be considered insiders to CMU because you have some level of access to critical assets. So when we look at insiders, though, and how they can possibly cause harm, we get into kind of two delineations. Malicious insiders, which broadly speaking are going to be folks who will purposely cause some kind of harm to an organization, as well as negligent insiders, which is more aligned with folks who don't necessarily mean to cause harm, but might accidentally do this. So in a most common case will be something like somebody who doesn't have proper training, clicking on a phishing email, somebody picking up a USB stick off the street, if you guys see Mr. Robot, and just plugging it into their work computer. So it's a quick show of hands. Who thinks that malicious insiders are more common? Yep. Okay. We got one. Who thinks that most insider threats are actually negligent or on accident? All right, well, the room has it. The most common type of insider threat is a negligent insider. And that's just something I like to share to kind of demystify the idea that we're some kind of secret police force trying to find the baddies within organizations. For the most part, our role is trying to mitigate unintentional risks. So let's start to understand insider threats a little bit better. Listed here are just a couple of the vectors for insider threat indicators that we can monitor. As you can understand, this is a whole load of information that's a little bit hard to look at. But let's break it down into another abstraction. Why do we monitor for insider threats? Here are a couple statistics I've grabbed from the Ponemon Institute as well as some other sources that kind of talk about some of the reasons that insider threats are still such a big concern. For one, we see that approximately 60% of cyber attacks that are reported from resulting from insider threats. 74% of companies have some level of vulnerability that's non-negligible to insider threats. And and there's almost a 50% increase in the occurrence of insider threats on the period that was observed from 2018 to 2020. So now that we kind of have a better understanding of the space of insider threats, we're going to move on to kind of my area of research, which is insider risk. So this is, again, bringing on some of the fundamental security concepts of threat and risk. If an insider threat is the potential for something to happen, insider risk is going to be the impact or likelihood that is associated if that threat becomes realized. So a way that we can look at this from a process view is seeing that insider threat actors, whether negligent or malicious, have access to critical assets and can impart an insider risk scenario. So just stepping back, seeing that we have insider threats and insider risks, I want to share just a little bit of some of the assumptions I make in this presentation and how we define insider threat and risk. Once again, there's an overlap that sees insider threats being agents and actors, whereas risk is this process of enumerating and trying to manage insider threats. This will become relevant again when we look into some of the projects I've done that kind of work at the intersection of threat detection and risk management. But backing up, let's take a little bit of a look at this concept we have here, insider risk scenarios. So within insider risk scenarios, there are four main categories that we identify here at CERT. That is intellectual property theft, sabotage of information technology, fraud, as well as workplace violence. But when we look at these, let's ask the question, why do we care about this? Especially when we talk about bringing privacy into the equation. So right now, there are conversations happening around user privacy, but we don't talk a lot about insider privacy, especially when we look at some of the practices that you imagine happen for monitoring insider threat. A common thing that you can, or a common idea you can take from this is that consumer privacy, which I'm assuming a lot of you guys are kind of focused on how to build into either applications or businesses, that does not equate to the same concepts in insider privacy. As we'll see in this presentation, insiders give up higher levels of privacy protections in order to join their organizations. Essentially, when you take a new job, or even when you accept an offer to go to a school, you sacrifice a certain level of your privacy as a bar to enter into that organization. And as we're going to explore, with the kind of emergence of new technologies, there are new vectors for privacy concerns that insiders are facing. So here we have a little bit of a comparison as we look at that concept of consumer privacy versus insider privacy. We see on the consumer privacy side some terms I'm sure you're familiar with. Consumers have some reasonable expectations of privacy. As well as that, with a lot of privacy legislation, you're afforded some greater autonomy in your choices related to privacy. There's some kind of regulations that enables opt-in, opt-out, alternative options, especially for things like cookie management. And there's a very powerful driver behind public perception of privacy practices. You know, nobody wants to feel like the products they buy are watching them. We turn, though, to the other side where we see, again, in practice, insiders aren't afforded these same privacy expectations. They make certain concessions of privacy and autonomy in joining their organizations. They essentially submit to mandatory data collections and records, and they are given constant exposure to monitoring. So let's talk a little bit about how we can get a better scoping of, how do we say insiders have privacy expectations? So this is going to go into a little bit of survey research that I've gone ahead and, I'm still in the process of doing, but what I've done here is essentially done some research that is aimed towards making thematic codings from survey data that I'm collecting. The whole goal of this is essentially to investigate employee attitudes and sentiments towards security monitoring within their organization targeted towards insider threat. Ideally, this is going to create some kind of mapping between privacy expectations and some level of the acceptance of employee surveillance. This has been done essentially through semi-structured surveys with themes around privacy expectations, monitoring reactions, and managing boundaries. I have here a little excerpt of kind of how this process works, where someone will give a response, what we can do from there. If you guys are familiar with kind of qualitative coding, taking some kind of code from that response and assigning some kind of selective theme to that. So a little bit of background of how I shaped my coding schema before I show it is actually based off of a previous study coming from Schoner. And this is the MAP-IT, or multiple approach pathways to insider threat, which kind of looks at some of the behavioral sides of why people will act a certain way to become insider threats, or how they feel in terms of norms of surveillance. What this has essentially informed is 4 major themes that I've listed out that I see coming from some of the responses. These themes are kind of conceptualizing privacy, or looking at that perception, looking at the experiences they have within their organizations when they are made aware to some level of what's going on in the surveillance field, how they have that relationship with their organization in terms of trust and transparency, as well as behavioral compliance, or essentially how well are they behaving within what they're supposed to be doing. Here is a little bit of interview output that I got from some of these surveys I got. So this is a little bit of a mapping of the coding. Essentially, what we see is some of the excerpts from the data we received. Showing here is, again, kind of that process that we use in order to kind of understand from a certain excerpt, such as, I understand why we need to do monitoring. We get this idea that it is positive, essentially, especially when they are given in some circumstance what the softwares are doing. There's a positive to neutral sentiment that can be formed from the codings. We see on the more neutral side, to some extent, people really accept that they're going to be surveilled whenever they join an organization. Not necessarily positively, but more of a neutral, accepting the norms that were defined by Schoner. And here's just kind of an example of a positive and a neutral coding scheme. I don't know if it's very visible from here. But we see, essentially, when we look into questions like emails or keyboard tracking, there's either a good perception of it or just some level of neutral acceptance. However, I added some additional data to this from pretty popular forums. Anybody here a user of Reddit? As the real security professionals here. So I wanted to kind of gauge from kind of another perspective, especially when people weren't approaching it from, an employee perspective. How are the perceptions of using these tools? And interestingly, I went and looked at some of the posts that were made into forums related to people who were actually implementing these tools. So we see here 3 of the forums I looked at within Reddit are MSP or managed service provider, sysadmin, or systems administrator, as well as cybersecurity. Essentially looking at the opinions of professionals when people ask about something adjacent to insider threat monitoring. Some easy visual indicators from here is the fact that all of these posts have a 0 upvote count, essentially indicating some level of negative sentiment. And as you'll see from some of the comments on these threads, there is a pretty subjective disdain for insider threat within these fields. So some of the form output we got kind of went along, as you guys can see here by the red, a pretty negative output in terms of the perceptions from our thematic coding. A couple of excerpts that I thought were pretty interesting include coming from the service provider Reddit. I, like a lot of folks, am very reticent. So this aligns with our theme of personal boundaries and kind of shows a, well, that's incorrectly coded, better version. But as we see, people have a generally more negative perception, as we see from their responses. People don't want to, say, babysit users. That was coming out of the cybersecurity Reddit. People don't essentially use this concept as some kind of way to monitor folks' behaviors. So we see when we run the same process, it is a generally low sentiment, and people are expressing codes like resistance or low trust, or really feeling as though their privacy boundaries aren't being respected. So that is what kind of gets us into the first theme of how to approach insider privacy. This is the theme of insider privacy by management. So a couple of privacy concerning insider risk management techniques, as you can imagine, include employee surveillance, data mining, behavior analysis, and activity monitoring. Essentially all the big scary words that make you feel like there is that supposed big brother software being operated by your company. This is exactly what feeds into that negative sentiment and that low perception of trust. So going into the idea of management and approaching insider privacy, I've done a little bit of strategic management frameworking for approaching insider risk. So this is going to be scoped to a little bit of research I was doing when it came to leveraging administrative data, or essentially data that companies hold that's specific about users, like HR, background checks, legal incidents, and the idea of leveraging this to existing insider threat detection. We can see that there are some pretty obvious strengths here. Comprehensive data monitoring, it's cost effective, it gives objective metrics. There are a couple weaknesses, of course, with any kind of data analytic tool that deals with people data. There is this concern of data quality issues, whether it's from poor entry. Of course, privacy concerns, a big theme that you're going to see here, but also just technological errors like high false positives and limited context. We do see opportunities, mainly in AI and ML, and other emerging technologies becoming more and more robust and better at error handling. Already, we see a lot of HR softwares like Workday are working on integration to existing company data sets just for its purposes. A little bit of key challenges I identified is and this is going to be kind of validated by my next research, is there's high risk of false positives. Subjectively speaking, there is a high impact of privacy violations to employees. And along with that, there is just some general business considerations like errors with data and computational costs. So this brings us to a little project that I've been working on called Trace, which is threat recognition through administrative correlation and extraction. Essentially, this looks at taking a nuanced approach to the idea of leveraging administrative data to detect insider threats. So a little bit about detection engineering for insider threat is it uses a systematic design of rules and models to essentially figure out what kind of activity is happening, whether it's malicious or whether it's indicative of a possible threat. And this contrasts with traditional monitoring that folks who might be a bit more familiar with cybersecurity know, like passive log collection or some kind of rules-based intrusion detection system. When it comes to leveraging data for insider threats, some of the issues that arise is, for one, a lot of this data is very siloed in the sense that while your company may have, IT logs that can help you identify possible insider threat incidents, there's also HR stuff as well as legal data that don't directly intersect, but can help paint a bigger picture. So, talking about how companies do this, our division did a little bit of an identification of some of the tools in insider threat detection. As you see, it is a mile wide and mile deep. The way I like to approach this is more of looking at these tools from a capabilities perspective. Essentially breaking down 4 main capabilities, which is data loss prevention, or essentially putting some kind of rules in place to prevent information from being either exfiltrated or lost. CM, which you may be familiar with, which is essentially just a capability to aggregate logs and make some kind of correlations. And then we step into user activity monitoring and user entity behavior analysis, which are very much the bread and butter of insider threat tooling. Essentially, user activity monitoring and UEBA or UAM and entity behavior analysis or UEBA are going to be the scoping of capabilities for context-aware machine learning detection. So we see user activity monitoring bigly being described by the ODNI, National Insider Threat Task Force, as the technical capability to observe and record the actions and activities of an individual at any time on any device. Essentially, this is going to be pretty similar to a CM, but kind of departing from that in the sense that it's able to pick up actions being taken by users, as well as have some kind of response capability to whether it's like a rules-based, like video capture, which is one of the minimum standards for being in a user activity monitoring software, or whether it's a certain format that it collects in order to kind of help monitor insider threats. UEBA, on the other hand, is kind of taking this concept of UAM and applying some kind of data science or behavior analysis capability to this. Essentially, as Microsoft defines it, analyzing logs and alerts from connected data sources to build a baseline of behavioral profiles. What we have here is essentially a little bit of a mapping of the relationship between UAM and UEBA. The way that you can basically look at it is UAM will collect data specific about users and try to get the evidence needed while it informs the UEBA to create some kind of behavioral risk profile that can possibly, indicate that someone might be an insider threat. So where this project essentially brings some level of novelty is this idea of the integration of non-technical data sets into machine learning approaches for doing this. So already I'll kind of preface, companies do use HR and legal data in their investigations. A lot of it is software-based, but even when we do kind of like program evaluations, we usually hear that there is some kind of communication happening between HR and the IT team to find possible malicious or negligent actors. But when we talk about non-technical data sets, we essentially look at this idea that corporate environments retain information about their employees outside of just their IT activities. So some examples of this include HR, which will have things like background checks, life events. So, hey, have they gotten married? Hey, have they gotten divorced? They'll keep records of their travel or PTO, like, have they gone somewhere concerning? Are they taking a lot of vacation time? On the other side, we see legal or administrative data. This will include things like legal incidents, like, hey, have they had some kind of intellectual property issue in the past? What kind of disciplinary actions have been put on the employee that maybe might have frustrated them? Do they have some kind of conflict of interest outside of work that is of concern? We, of course, have a kind of larger subscaling of these non-technical data sets, but you can essentially think of them as data that exists as information outside of what you traditionally think of as IT log data. So a little bit of context for this is 62% of insider threats show HR visible red flags before an incident happens. So essentially, if an incident happens where, say, somebody commits workplace violence, there may have been an HR indication that, hey, they have a history of violence. If someone is about to do, say, intellectual property fraud through sending company secrets to another company, legal might have data that indicates, hey, they have a conflict of interest that is of concern. Essentially, we look at this idea that when we combine this pre-existing data, it can give context to IT data in order to understand where these anomalies happen. So, talking a little bit about the approach I'm taking, the challenge lies in identifying subtle patterns of malicious behavior from essentially really big amounts of normal activity. The assumptions I make are that IT logs just aren't sufficient for detecting insider threats. They lack context about the employee's role, access privileges, employment status, among other things. Along with that, there is some kind of value that we assume from integrating administrative data into these IT logs, essentially creating this better capability or more accurate, comprehensive data set that can detect threats. We also assume that, generally speaking, a lot of organizations really aren't leveraging this data in their investigations computationally in the best way possible. So essentially, we break into this idea that this data is siloed and investigations aren't using the best means for finding insider threats through administrative data. This is where I propose this novel approach of using machine learning to correlate non-technical data sets to technical data sets to essentially create these better these better profiles of employees for improved detection. What we see here is essentially I've created synthetic data based off of the CERT insider threat data set and pre-process and merge that through a random forest classifier to see if we can essentially correlate IT logs with some kind of HR legal data with the unique identifier. Some of the objectives here are kind of listed essentially in developing this methodology to cross-reference administrative data and to train a model to better detect insider threats. Preliminary results is kind of showing that 89% of flagged users were true threats, essentially reducing an existing issue of false positive rates. Pretty good recall rate of 85% for threat detection, as well as excellent separability from our ROC AUC. The false positives we did get were mostly from insiders with legitimate high access. And here's just another detection model that shows some of these results. But essentially the finding was that from a managerial standpoint, there is an advantage to ramping up the usage of things like machine learning to try to better handle data or better integrate data in a form of surveillance to essentially try to enumerate and monitor your employees. And this is where we essentially start to impede on the privacy of insiders. So, if we've talked about how looks like from a managerial perspective, what are some ways that insider privacy can be perhaps mitigated through technology? So, the way I like to look at it is through the use of privacy-enhancing technologies, or PETs. I'm sure you guys probably are well familiar with all of these. So some of the relevant PETs for insider threat management that I've identified include synthetic data generation, as you kind of previously saw in my experiment, k-anonymity, and homomorphic encryption. WebZon has done a little bit of a breakdown of how well these work for the intended purposes. In the case of synthetic data generation, you have the ability to not only protect levels of privacy from eliminating things like PII or scalability, you can also overcome data scarcity and mitigate bias by having some control over the distribution of that data. Essentially, this is going to be used for the purpose of training models without having to actually train them on actual people in order to ideally be able to use them without the worry that you've trained it on actual PII. Some of the negative impacts from this is, of course, a constant challenge of realism versus synthetic data. And despite how good SDG has gotten, there is always going to be some nuance of human behavior that you won't get compared to using real data, as well as the quality of data that comes out of SDG having some limitations. The next technology I assessed was k-anonymity, or essentially, having the ability to censor certain aspects of employees' information. A great idea behind this is you prevent re-identification attacks and have limited levels of user anonymization. Again, the issues that arise is going to be the loss of information that comes with implementing k-anonymity, having some kind of barrier to identification. And once again, the realism versus synthetic aspect, as well as having some level of insider advantage, where someone who is familiar with what practices are happening is going to be able to kind of game the re-identification practices. Lastly, we have homomorphic encryption, which is still an evolving field compared to the other two, but has a great potential for privacy preservation while still maintaining the ability to do robust machine learning, and heavily reduces the concerns for breaches, whether it's from a data breach perspective or member inference attacks. The issues that exist here, again, are going to be, for one, computational overhead. As you can imagine, doing homomorphic encryption at scale or robust machine learning while also doing encryption is very costly, as well as having some level of limited functionality from encrypted data. What this shows, though, is that there is some common ground between insider risk and insider privacy. In both cases, the skill sets involved are having this concern with human factors and security, both parties being concerned with protecting data, and having this balance of both for maintaining trust between employees and their employers. So we see here that at the moment there still is a little bit of a imbalance in the scale, where the real protections for insider privacy at the moment is mainly the use of privacy impact assessments or data protection impact assessments, well, in the end, you're still going to be racked up against practices and insider risk like data collection, surveillance, and analytics. But incorporating some level of respect and accountability is the key idea behind balancing the scale. And both are needed to have that perfect level of trust, insider privacy, insider risk. So once again, approaching it from that management perspective, we identified a couple of questions to ask an insider risk management program when it comes to how to properly respect employees when using some of these pretty robust technical surveillance techniques. Big aspects you'll see here include what kind of systems collect or use the personal data? What controls are in place to protect that data? What recurring activities should the program be prepared for? What events can trigger privacy requirement or consultation? And then again, what even are those privacy requirements? But taking one last perspective on this, I like to make the argument that the strongest protection is always going to be having some kind of level of privacy enforced by policy. So looking again at current perspectives in privacy policies, let's see where insiders are protected. At the moment, there are some level of consumer privacy policies, but they're not necessarily meant for insiders, as we've discussed. They're mainly targeted towards opt-in or trying to collect data off of users of a service. There are acceptable use policies that kind of outline how information technology is used within enterprise environments. However, these essentially go back to the idea of leaving your reasonable expectations at the door, because by signing these, you're kind of abiding by whatever the company is enforcing. And oftentimes you don't have a lot of pull in that area. And this is where I say having some kind of privacy at the insider threat and risk program level is where you have this opportunity for respecting privacy. So identified here are some principles for insider privacy protection from GDPR that our team has kind of identified in our common sense guide. These are lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization, a couple others that you guys are probably familiar with. As you can imagine, these essentially are the kind of privacy protections that are usually thought of when it comes to consumer privacy, but have the ability to be enforced. And already, we're starting to see subjectively, some legal precedents are being set favoring insiders. Even in a lot of news stories now, you're starting to see a lot of pushback from employees who are kind of wary of living in surveillance from their employers. So let's talk about a couple key ethical risks, especially in the age of AI, for insider threat monitoring. Some of these issues mainly revolve around privacy violations. Basically looking at this idea that AI systems are taking all this data related to people, things that are usually frowned upon whenever we think about this in a consumer sense. There's a lot of talk in the news of, this application is doing all sorts of analytics on my personal data. Along with this, there is that risk of re-identification, even with anonymized data. There is concerns about bias and fairness, especially when it comes to model perpetuated biases. Plenty of studies have indicated that using poor training data, or even just a poor approach to implementing data analysis, can lead to unfair treatment of certain people groups, and this extends to employees. An example of this could be over-surveillance of minority groups due to biased training data, which has been proved in multiple studies such as predictive policing. Along with that, there is a general issue of the lack of transparency. Essentially, people aren't properly informed by how they're being monitored. And this is a huge problem. I mean, a lot of the outrage articles you'll see nowadays about people realizing just how much they're being surveilled by their employers is because there really wasn't any kind of opt-in, aside from, hey, you work from us, so this is rolling out. And a big one I want to address is going to be accountability gaps, which is having some kind of difficulty in assigning responsibility. Whose fault is it if something goes wrong? Is it the employers? Is it the developers? Is there some kind of issue that needs to be held accountable for negligence that leads to false positives, um, leading to people facing some kind of wrong consequences or disciplinary actions? So a tool that I've used to kind of do a bit of an assessment on this practice is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. Came out around last year through a lot of what I was doing for my dissertation into disarray, so that's why I've kind of rephrased it here. But we see that their general approach is govern, map, measure, and manage four key controls for looking at AI systems. Along with that, I've done a little bit of a risk mapping and stakeholder impact related to these kind of issues identified, mainly looking at how employees will mainly suffer from, having a lack of trust and unfair treatment. But there is also harms for organizations at each one of these risks, such as facing legal penalties, facing reputational damage, and at a larger level, having some kind of financial or organizational crisis. So, as you can see here, I've done a little bit of a mapping for the ARMF, mainly looking at how some of these controls can directly apply to user activity monitoring. Some of the biggest issues that I see mainly come from concerns of unauthorized access, data leaks, privacy violations, and bias in AI models, not respecting privacy. Along with this, I've actually also kind of linked some of these threats secondarily to the MITRE panoptic framework, trying to get a better idea essentially of, hey, where do these threats lie in terms of the downstream harms that come after we just identify what they are from the RMF? Essentially, it all leads back to this idea that all of these risks will have serious harms towards both employees and organizations. So, some of the mitigation strategies I propose in response to this is going to be the use of privacy-preserving technologies, taking some level of fortitude towards ensuring bias mitigation, having some kind of practice to incorporate transparency and explainability in what kind of practices are being used to monitor employees, as well as having mechanisms for holding folks accountable for making sure things go right and facing consequences if things go wrong. So this is where I get into the idea of there need to be policy solutions for handling this. The first solution I propose is the expansion of existing privacy and civil liberties legislations, essentially looking at addressing privacy expectations, accountability for organizations, and the empowerment of individuals. So breaking that down, the way to address privacy expectations is looking at this problem that there isn't a proper form of accountability if organizations are, say, over-surveilling their employees or misusing technology in a way that causes some level of harm. What needs to happen, in my perspective in this area, is amendments to things like the GDPR and CCPA and varying levels of, well, you guys are familiar, the US is a patchwork of privacy legislations, but there needs to be some level of unique call out towards protecting folks within organizations and enterprises who have the potential to be subjected to unnecessary levels of surveillance. The two kind of controls to this I would like to see added would be clear guidelines on what constitutes reasonable monitoring and what crosses that line into invasive surveillance, as well as the ability to have some reasonable form of employee consent, which will explicitly get the consent of employees before they're subjected to monitoring policies. In addressing privacy expectations, there's this general problem that employees basically have to give up their reasonable expectations of privacy as some level of, bar to join an organization. The solution that I propose is having mandatory reporting and auditing requirements for organizations, essentially having some kind of audit that will, similar to how organizations are passed to privacy regulations, have organizations be subject to third-party investigations to ensure compliance with these laws, as well as having them provide internal transparency reports about what practices they are using related to monitoring, data collections, and any kind of incident they have had with doing those practices. And lastly, in this policy solution, I think that there needs to be some level of empowerment for individuals, essentially returning the ability for employees or other insiders to have some kind of stake in making these decisions within enterprises. There should be some mechanism for letting employees appeal monitoring decisions that they believe violate their rights. It shouldn't be, going back to, the idea of providing consent. Hey, we're going to be reading all of your private messages on your personal device, or else you're fired. There should be a way to fight back against that, explicitly written into data privacy legislations. And there should be expansions as such to possible blowback against whistleblowers who want to call out unethical or illegal monitoring practices. And lastly, I also have a second policy alternative, which is establishment of compliance controls for the technologies being used in these programs. Essentially looking not just at the organization, but trying to create some kind of ethical audits for the actual software itself. So the first way that I think the first thing I think needs to be incorporated is some kind of mandate of, when it's applicable, using privacy preserving or privacy enhancing technologies. Right now, a lot of companies are going kind of using a break things Silicon Valley approach to using AI-driven surveillance. Essentially thinking, hey, how can we ingest as much data as possible without considering the privacy risks? Which is why when, these are being developed, there needs to be some kind of mandate if a certain methodology is being used, that an according privacy-preserving technology can be incorporated. The things I see definitely being used at a baseline could be data minimization as well as anonymization. Bias mitigation should also be explicitly built into design of these softwares, such as having some kind of audit to ensure that there's a diversity of training data, as well as regular testing against other models to mandate that these models have some kind of compliance for bias and fairness, which gets reported to regulatory bodies. And lastly, there should be a level of accountability for the folks developing these tools. Developers of surveillance technologies, as we said, sometimes can prioritize functionality over privacy and civil liberties, which is why these developers should have to do a privacy impact assessment in the design process, as well as there being some kind of industry-wide ethical guidelines that should guide the development and deployment of these surveillance tools. So in conclusion, the main takeaway from kind of some of these disparate points I've shown today is, at that nexus of enterprise surveillance and organizational trust, you really need a combination of management, policy, and technology in order to preserve privacy in insider risk management. Thank you. Are there any questions?